The morning sun on July 5, 1943, struggled to pierce the thick haze of smoke and dust hanging over the Russian steppes. Thousands of engines roared in unison, creating a vibration that could be felt deep within the chest of every soldier on the ground. This was the beginning of the Battle of Kursk, a confrontation of unprecedented scale and ferocity. In the air above the sprawling wheat fields, the German Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force prepared for a duel to the death. Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers formed up in echelon formations, their gull wings casting ominous shadows on the dry earth below. They were the tip of the spear intended to smash the Soviet anti-tank defenses before the panzers even began their advance. The air crackled with tension as radio chatter filled the headsets of pilots on both sides. Below the gathering armadas lay the Kursk salient, a bulge in the front line that had become the focal point of the entire war in the east. The German High Command had devised Operation Citadel to pinch off this salient and destroy the Soviet forces within it. Success meant stabilizing the Eastern Front and regaining the strategic initiative after the disaster at Stalingrad. Failure, however, promised a catastrophe from which the Wehrmacht might never recover. The stakes were absolute and the tension was palpable. Every commander knew that the outcome of the war hung in the balance on this summer morning. The pilots in their cockpits checked their instruments one last time, knowing that many of them would not live to see the sunset. The fate of nations rested on the wings of their machines. For months, the Soviet Union had been preparing for this exact moment, turning the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in the history of warfare. They had dug thousands of miles of trenches, laid millions of mines, and positioned thousands of anti-aircraft guns. But the Soviet commanders knew that ground defenses alone would not be enough to stop the German blitzkrieg. They needed to challenge the Luftwaffe for control of the sky. The Soviet Air Force had spent the previous year rebuilding and modernizing its fleet. New fighter planes like the Lavochkin La-5 and the Yakovlev Yak-9 were arriving in numbers, ready to challenge the technical superiority of the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The stage was set for a collision of industrial might. At the center of this aerial maelstrom was Hans Ulrich Rudel, a Stuka pilot who would become a legend among his peers. He flew the Ju-87G variant, a modified dive bomber equipped with two massive 37mm cannons under its wings. These guns were designed to punch through the thin top armor of Soviet tanks, turning the slow-moving Stuka into a lethal tank destroyer. Rudel was a man of singular focus and determination, driven by a belief in his duty and his skills. As he led his squadron toward the front lines, he scanned the horizon for the dark shapes of Soviet armor. To him, the chaotic battlefield was a canvas, and his aircraft was the brush that would paint a picture of destruction. The initial German assault began with a massive aerial bombardment designed to blind the Soviet defenses. Waves of Heinkel 111 and Junkers 88 bombers dropped tons of high explosives on Soviet airfields and command centers. The ground shook violently as craters erupted across the landscape, throwing dirt and debris hundreds of feet into the air. However, the Soviet Air Force was not caught sleeping on the ground, as they had been in 1941. Radar stations and forward observers had alerted the squadrons, and Soviet fighters were already scrambling to intercept the incoming bombers. The sky quickly transformed into a swirling dogfight involving hundreds of aircraft. Tracers arced through the blue canvas, leaving trails of smoke as planes twisted and turned in a deadly dance. The sheer density of aircraft over the Kursk battlefield was unlike anything seen before in the history of warfare. In a sector only a few miles wide, hundreds of fighters and bombers jostled for position. The noise was deafening, a constant drone of engines punctuated by the staccato rattle of machine guns and the boom of cannon fire. Mid-air collisions were a very real danger, as pilots fixated on their targets lost track of their surroundings. Burning wreckage fell from the sky like meteors, crashing into the tank battles raging below. For the infantry on the ground, there was no respite. If the tanks did not kill them, the bombs falling from above surely would. The air war and the ground war had merged into a singular total hell. Hans Ulrich Rudel dived his Stuka toward a column of Soviet T-34 tanks that were rushing to reinforce the front line. The wind screamed past his canopy as he lined up his sights on the rear of the lead tank. He fired his cannons and watched as the armor-piercing rounds found their mark. The tank shuddered and exploded, sending a turret flying into the air. Rudel pulled up sharply, narrowly avoiding the debris and the return fire from ground troops. His aircraft was slow and vulnerable to enemy fighters, but in the hands of an expert, it was a devastating weapon. He circled back for another pass, ignoring the tracers that zipped past his wings. This was the role of the Schlachflieger, the battle flyer, who fought in close coordination with the ground troops. While the Stukas hammered the ground forces, the German fighter pilots in their Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 fighters tried to sweep the skies clear. They were outnumbered, but they possessed superior tactics and experience. The German aces used the vertical plane, diving from high altitude to strike at the Soviet formations before climbing back up to safety. They called this energy fighting, and it allowed them to dictate the terms of the engagement. However, the Soviet pilots were learning fast. They began to adopt more aggressive tactics, flying in pairs and using their radios to coordinate attacks. The days of the Luftwaffe having free rein over the Eastern Front were coming to an end. The Soviet answer to the German armor was the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, a ground attack aircraft so heavily armored that pilots called it the flying tank. It was an ugly brute of a machine, but it was incredibly durable and packed a massive punch. Armed with cannons, rockets, and bombs, the Sturmoviks roamed the battlefield in packs, hunting for German Tiger and Panther tanks. They flew at treetop level, skimming the contours of the land to avoid German fighters and flak. When they found a target, they unleashed a storm of fire that could strip the tracks off a tank or set its engine block aflame. The German infantry feared the Sturmovik more than any other weapon in the Soviet arsenal. As the battle dragged on into its second and third days, the intensity of the air war showed no signs of abating. The Luftwaffe flew thousands of sorties each day, pushing their pilots and machines to the breaking point. Mechanics worked feverishly through the short summer nights to patch up bullet holes and refuel the hungry engines. Fatigue became a major factor as pilots flew 5 or 6 missions a day, fueled only by adrenaline and fear. Mistakes became more common and the loss rate began to climb. The German logistical system strained to keep up with the demand for fuel and ammunition. Every bomb dropped and every gallon of fuel burned had to be transported hundreds of miles to the front. On the northern flank of the salient near the town of Ponyri, the battle turned into a grinder of attrition. The German Ninth Army struggled to break through the layered Soviet defenses. Here the air war was focused on breaking the deadlock. German bombers pounded the Soviet trench lines, trying to blast a path for the infantry. But for every trench destroyed, the Soviets seemed to dig 2 more. The Soviet fighters were ferocious in their defense of the airspace over Ponyri. They engaged the German bombers before they could release their payloads, forcing them to jettison their bombs harmlessly in open fields. The airspace over Ponyri became a graveyard for the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, on the southern flank, the German 4th Panzer Army was making better progress, but at a terrible cost. The open steppe provided little cover, and the tank battles here were massive and chaotic. The Luftwaffe concentrated its efforts on supporting the spearheads of the SS Panzer divisions. Stuka squadrons acted as flying artillery, silencing Soviet anti-tank gun batteries that were holding up the advance. The coordination between the German air and ground controllers was exemplary. A panzer commander could radio for air support and have Stukas on the target within minutes. This tactical flexibility gave the Germans a significant advantage in the early days of the offensive. However, the Soviet Air Force had a surprise in store for the Germans. They had developed a new type of hollow charge bomb specifically designed to destroy tanks. These small bombs were dropped in clusters from the Sturmoviks, raining down on the German armored columns. Even the thick armor of the Tiger tanks was vulnerable to a direct hit on the top deck. The psychological effect of these attacks was devastating. German tank crews felt naked, and exposed knowing that death could rain down from the sky at any moment. The Sturmovik pilots grew bolder, venturing deep behind German lines to attack supply columns and assembly areas. The question that haunted the German commanders was whether they could sustain this level of effort. The Luftwaffe was bleeding strength with every passing hour. They had started the battle with a finite number of aircraft, and replacements were slow to arrive. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of men and machines. For every Yak fighter shot down, another one appeared to take its place. The industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, which had been moved east of the Ural Mountains, was now producing aircraft at a rate that Germany could not hope to match. The war of attrition was tilting in favor of the Soviets. By July 12th, the German advance in the north had stalled completely, while the southern pincer was approaching the village of Prokhorovka. Here, the largest tank engagement in history was about to take place. As hundreds of tanks clashed in the dust and smoke, the air war reached a crescendo. The sky above Prokhorovka was a chaotic jumble of twisting metal and fire. German and Soviet aircraft engaged in a desperate melee at low altitude, often flying right through the smoke plumes of burning tanks. It was impossible to tell friend from foe in the confusion. The air support that the Germans relied upon was becoming less effective as the Soviet fighters contested every inch of the sky. Hans Ulrich Rudel was there at Prokhorovka, flying mission after mission to support the SS divisions. He described the scene as a boiling cauldron of fire and steel. His cannons overheated from constant use, and his aircraft was riddled with shrapnel. Yet he continued to fly, driven by the desperate situation on the ground. He saw the Soviet tank reserves pouring into the battle like a flood. No matter how many tanks he destroyed, more seemed to emerge from the dust. It was a realization that struck many German pilots during those critical days, the realization that they were fighting a hydra that could not be killed. The turning point of the air war came not from a single decisive battle, but from the cumulative weight of losses. The Luftwaffe had lost over 500 aircraft in the first week of the operation. Many of their most experienced aces were dead or missing. The loss of these veterans was a blow from which the fighter arm would never recover. New pilots were thrown into the fray with barely enough training to take off and land, let alone fight against hardened Soviet veterans. The quality of the German pilot corps began to degrade rapidly, while the Soviet pilots were gaining confidence and skill with every mission. On the ground, the German offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. Operation Citadel was grinding to a halt. To make matters worse for Germany, the Western Allies had landed in Sicily on July 10th. This new threat forced Hitler to divert vital air and armored units from the Eastern Front to the Mediterranean. The Luftwaffe squadrons at Kursk were stripped of their strength just as the battle was reaching its climax. This strategic diversion was the final nail in the coffin for the German hopes of victory. The initiative had passed irrevocably to the Soviet Union. The Soviet High Command seized the moment and launched their own counteroffensive known as Operation Kutuzov. The hunters became the hunted. The Soviet Air Force surged forward, attacking the retreating German columns and pounding their airfields. The Luftwaffe, now on the defensive, found itself stretched too thin to cover the retreat. The Stukas, which had been the terror of the skies, were now vulnerable targets for the swarming Soviet fighters. The air superiority that Germany had enjoyed since the beginning of the war in the East was gone forever. The technological race also played a significant role in the shifting balance of power. The introduction of the Lavochkin La-5FN gave the Soviet pilots a fighter that was equal to or better than the German Bf-109G at low altitudes. Its fuel-injected engine and heavy cannon armament made it a formidable adversary. Soviet pilots discovered that they could outturn the Germans and force them into low-speed dogfights where the La-5 excelled. The German technical advantage was eroding just as their numerical disadvantage was growing. One of the most remarkable aspects of the air war at Kursk was the role of the female pilots of the Soviet Air Force. The Night Witches of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew obsolete biplanes on harassment missions against German positions. They cut their engines and glided silently over their targets, dropping bombs before the Germans knew they were there. These women flew with incredible bravery, often returning with their canvas planes shredded by flak. Their psychological impact on the exhausted German troops was immense, depriving them of sleep and keeping them in a constant state of anxiety. The logistics of the air war were mind-boggling. The Luftwaffe consumed over 40,000 tons of fuel during the battle. The ground crews performed miracles, keeping the aircraft serviceable in primitive conditions. Dust was a constant enemy, clogging air filters and grinding down engines. The heat was oppressive, turning the cockpits into ovens. Despite these challenges, the maintenance crews worked around the clock, driven by the knowledge that the pilots' lives depended on their work. But even their heroic efforts could not compensate for the lack of spare parts and replacement aircraft. As the German forces began their withdrawal, the air war took on a grim desperation. The Luftwaffe was tasked with covering the retreat, preventing the Soviet Air Force from turning the withdrawal into a rout. Fighter pilots flew until they collapsed from exhaustion, engaging vastly superior numbers of enemy aircraft. They fought with the courage of men who knew the end was approaching. The skies over the retreating columns were filled with burning aircraft and parachutes. It was a fighting retreat, but a retreat nonetheless. The Battle of Kursk was the graveyard of the Luftwaffe. The losses suffered in July and August 1943 broke the back of the German fighter arm. They would continue to fight until the end of the war, but they would never again be able to mount a strategic offensive or guarantee air superiority over the battlefield. The experienced leaders, the flight instructors, and the aces who had honed their skills over years of combat were gone. They lay buried in the Russian soil or scattered as wreckage across the steppes. For the Soviet Air Force, Kursk was a baptism of fire that forged a new generation of aces. Pilots like Ivan Kozhedub, who would become the top Allied ace of the war, scored their first victories over the Kursk salient. They learned the hard lessons of aerial combat and emerged as masters of their trade. The VVS, as the Soviet Air Force was known, had transformed from a clumsy giant into a professional and deadly fighting force. They had taken the best the Luftwaffe could throw at them, and they had prevailed. The legacy of the air war at Kursk is often overshadowed by the clash of tanks on the ground. However, the two were inextricably linked. The tanks could not operate without air cover, and the aircraft existed to support the tanks. It was the first true example of modern combined arms warfare on a massive scale. The lessons learned at Kursk would influence military doctrine for decades to come. It demonstrated that air superiority was a prerequisite for victory in conventional warfare. The sheer numbers involved are staggering. Over 5,000 aircraft were committed to the battle by both sides. The intensity of the combat resulted in the loss of thousands of planes and pilots. It was a war of attrition in the air that mirrored the slaughter on the ground. The steppes of Russia had become a vast consuming furnace of men and material. The scale of the destruction is difficult to comprehend even today. One cannot forget the human cost of this aerial conflict. Behind every statistic was a young man, often barely out of his teens, strapped into a machine of war. They faced terror and death on a daily basis. They watched their friends die in balls of fire. They wrote letters home that would never be delivered. Whether they fought for the Iron Cross or the Red Star, they shared the same sky and the same terrible fate. Their courage and their sacrifice are woven into the history of this battle. The failure of Operation Citadel marked the beginning of the long retreat for the Wehrmacht. The Soviet steamroller began to move west, gathering speed and power. The Luftwaffe could only harass the edges of this advance, unable to stop it. The air war had shifted from a battle for dominance to a desperate struggle for survival. The shadow of the Soviet Air Force grew longer with each passing day, covering the retreat of the German armies all the way back to Berlin. In the end, the Battle of Kursk proved that the blitzkrieg tactic was dead. The era of quick victories won by armored spearheads, supported by overwhelming air power, was over. The war had become a grinding struggle of industrial output and manpower. In this new kind of war, Germany could not hope to win. The air war over Kursk was the crucible in which the final defeat of the Third Reich was forged. The burned-out hulks of tanks and aircraft that littered the battlefield were quickly reclaimed by nature. The grass grew back over the scorched earth and the craters filled with rain. But the memory of those days in July 1943 remains. It serves as a reminder of the terrible cost of war and the limits of human endurance. The roar of the engines has long since faded, but the echo of the battle still resonates through history. Historians still debate the tactical decisions made during the air war. Could the Luftwaffe have won if they had focused on different targets? Was the diversion of forces to Sicily the critical error? These questions will never have definitive answers. What remains certain is that the Soviet pilots, through their grit and determination, broke the myth of German invincibility. They proved that the Luftwaffe could be beaten, and in doing so, they changed the course of the Second World War. As we look back on the Battle of Kursk, we must remember the airmen who fought and died in the skies above. They were the knights of a modern age, jousting with cannons and machine guns. Their battlefield was the endless blue sky, and their graves were the clouds. Their story is one of technology, courage, and the brutal reality of total war. It is a story that deserves to be told and remembered. The Battle of Kursk was more than just a clash of steel, it was a turning point in human history. The air war was the anvil upon which the German war machine was smashed. The Soviet victory paved the way for the liberation of Eastern Europe and the eventual fall of Nazi Germany. The sacrifices made by the pilots of the Soviet Air Force ensured that the sun would eventually set on the Third Reich. Today, the wheat fields of Kursk are peaceful. The wind whispers through the grain where once shrapnel flew. But if you listen closely to the whisper of time, you can almost hear the faint drone of a Stuka engine or the roar of a Yak fighter climbing for altitude. The ghosts of the air war are still there, watching over the land they fought to claim. Their legacy is etched into the very soil and sky of this place forever.